Welcome back, everyone. Really sorry for the technical hitch there that we have experienced. We do apologize for that, but happy to be back. Joseph, you were making some very pertinent comments there. You can proceed.
Yeah, okay. So I was saying, they conducted research and say wildlife migrated or almost extincted within the crater floor, many of them. And they say one of the reasons is that crater has become bushy and thorny, which is not friendly to small wildlife. They can be hunted easily and many others, except for the rhinoceros, who has been almost extincted from the people who have given guns to protect them anyway. And there are many records to that effect. So they say when the Maasai were removed and their livestock now do not have like time access to the area and the use of the grass, which otherwise is controlling the invasive plants. Ngorongoro crater particularly is now the leading place in Ngorongoro with invasive plants. The scientists so much believed by the government, part of them who have participated in writing the report now used by the government to relocate the Maasai has said Ngorongoro crater, the number of wildlife has not remained the same again. And almost more than half of the wildebeest has got out of the Ngorongoro crater. So, which otherwise means, in a layman language, if you were to evict the Maasai again now in the highlands, maybe the same phenomena will repeat, which otherwise the wildlife might migrate even to other areas. And again, because they are saying about how do we then conserve, I'm saying you have big star hotels in the crater rim, and the government spokesperson screamed that the Maasai huts are threatening the ecology, and actually was comparing Maasai huts as against Serena and saying no, Serena, there is a very good land assessment that has been conducted. Look on the Maasai bombers, and he was laughing that the Maasai bombers and huts do damage the ecosystem more than the big star hotels. So yes, we want Ngorongoro to be conserved better than it is, but I'm saying it is not 3 cows because I said from 1957 to 2018 there is an increase of 3 cows. It is not those 3 cows that are damaging Ngorongoro. It is some reckless administration. It is administration who disregard both the Maasai, thinking they are not deserving good rights, and disregarding the nature for greed of money. And that's why they are not thinking of maybe regulating even tourism activities that are damaging, because they are always going in numbers. You know better than me maybe. Crater is so much visited than any other place in Ngorongoro, and is the most damaged area. The second area is near Serengeti, actually from Endulen. You go to Marsh area. Is another place which has been significantly damaged because of tourism. We tried to use the satellite imagery. There were 4 roads in the crater in 1976. Now there are 26. That otherwise you are affecting biodiversity in the place you like the most. There was 1 road in the marsh. It is now roady almost everywhere. The big hotels and the camps and the others. And we must categorize. Tourism is not conservation. It's not synonymous to conservation. Those are different things, different disciplines. One is the business, and one is related to nature and others. And to make one point is, Maasai pastoralism has been proved scientifically from time immemorial, and at least by non-scientists, that they do not affect the nature. They actually add, as part of the authors has argued, Maasai do add value to the nature. You do not have to evict the Maasai. You just have to allow them to practice pastoralism, because pastoralism is friendly to nature. And this is why You go everywhere almost in the world. There is no place you can compare to Ngorongoro, Serengeti, Mara. It is the Maasai who has made it, and now they are being accused by people who has almost eaten every single wildlife in there. Because wildlife were almost in every single area in this world. People has finished them, and they are now accusing the Maasai that they are also almost smelling like threatening them, than coming to study how is this possible that a wildlife will stay almost in the same area with the Maasai and nothing dangerous happen between themselves. Now they're arguing. Actually, there were three or so kids eaten by lion in 2020. It was 2020 or last year. Now government is using that as a propaganda. And we are trying to analyze where other cases of wildlife attack has happened. And we found from Ngorongoro, you go to Karatu, 28, but they are saying nothing at all, that they are also being endangered, if at all, that if a wildlife like will or attack a person, then you evict the entire society. Then you evict almost everyone in this country. And that's madness. Our opinion is you should not resettle society for purpose of conserving area. There are millions ways you can conserve, and the Maasai has proved so much than the other that it is very possible to conserve area, to maintain wildlife, and because wildlife, then ecology and others, and their life continues, is very possible. But they think, because the argument by then, like of Grimsek and Bernhard, they were saying in 1956 that the Maasai number has increased so much that they cannot tolerate. In 1985, the argument then was the Maasai has surpassed the carrying capacity of the Ngorongoro in 1988 actually. That if you are to allow them 3 years, Ngorongoro will extinct. Now in 2018, they were saying if you are to allow them to 2038, that narrative must be false, must be born on lies, because then Ngorongoro will have almost fallen entirely. So yes, we want to conserve, but that is not conservation. Ngorongoro is a military base in a conservation rhetoric, violating almost every single right of the people lawfully living in there. And I said, and it is better to emphasize this, there are so much stain of Nazism in Tanzania protected areas, not only Ngorongoro. There are so much of the colonial element in Tanzania conservation philosophy. So this attack on the Maasai today, yes, it is Maasai today. Tomorrow they can go to anyone, and they have gone to many. Because actually, Bernhard, in one of his arguments, said, I can sit down with Idi Amin because conservation work better in a dictatorship, not a democracy. And they have now proved to us that they are terrorizing everyone without engaging them, because their founder has said conservation work better in a dictatorship. And I think this is not conservation. This is a military experiment with the with conservation names, because conservation then anyone can accept. I think I'm clear on that.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm so happy to see Tundu Lissu here, the deputy chair of the main opposition party in Tanzania, that's Chadema. Lissu, it's so good to see you here. We've had a very, very interesting conversation here, trying to understand the legal issues behind the forcible eviction of the Maasai indigenous people. We've talked about human rights issues. We've had accounts, of course, from Joseph, who is, a resident of the Ngorongoro area. But Lissu, much of what especially I really wanted to understand also from you, and I'm so happy Joseph has mentioned, is, and I'll just make it a general question, what do you make of the forced eviction of the Maasai community in Tanzania, Lissu?
Many thanks for the invitation. I'm sorry I've come in late. I must also apologize for the fact that I may not stay for long. The truth is, I'm actually down with COVID since Friday of last week. I was only diagnosed yesterday, and I'm under quarantine and for the next 10 days at least. So I'm not in the best of my health, but I'll say a few words, and then if I disappear, you should understand that I'm gone because my health does not allow me to participate as I would normally do. Having said that, the subject is of great interest to me personally. As you may know, I have been very loud and very vocal on the issues that are going on in Ngorongoro district at the moment. But it is also true that I've been involved in the struggle for to defend the land and resource rights of Tanzania's pastoralists. Today, the Maasai are possibly the only pastoralists who remain in our country. And I've been involved in trying to understand the tragedy that has befallen the pastoralists of Tanzania as a result primarily of conservation, and that is why, even though I'm under the weather, I thought I should come and say and share some of my views on the subject. Conservation in Tanzania, and I think I will not be wrong if I say, in the colonial world, was always founded on violence and dispossession. Violence of the colonial regimes, and the dispossession, violence in order to dispossess the natives of their lands and of their resources, lands and resources such as wildlife, such as pastures, such as minerals, and so on and so forth. So conservation in our part of the world has been synonymous with violent dispossession of the natives by governments, firstly by colonial governments during colonial period when the foundations of our conservation were laid. But if you speak of the Tanzania, especially after 1961, after independence. In other words, I want to suggest to you that even though the foundations of this violent dispossession of the Maasai peoples started during the colonial period, it got much worse. The story got even more violent, even more barbaric after independence. This is how. At independence in 1961, Serengeti was the only national park Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can.
Yes, hold and interrupted me. So in 1961, at independence, Serengeti was the only national park in Tanganyika. There were numerous game reserves, yes, but the Serengeti was the only national park. Now, you will appreciate the difference between a national park and a game reserve or any other category of protection. And the difference is crucial. In a national park, at least as envisaged under the National Parks Ordinance, in a national park, there is a complete prohibition of not only residents, but of all consumptive users of the land and resources of the area concerned. So, in other words, in a national park is an area where there has been a complete dispossession of the natives who were there before the area was designated as a national park. In a game reserve or any other category of a protected area, on the other hand, you will have varying degrees of restriction. In a game reserve, for instance, you will have licensed hunting. You cannot hunt as you wish. You can only hunt if you have a license, and the licenses are given by the government authorities, by the game department during the colonial period, and the game department since 1961. But in a game reserve, normally the right to live in the area, to graze animals, to collect firewood and wild fruits and such other consumptive uses by natives would normally be protected. So in a game reserve or a game controlled area or an open area, these are the categories that were created under the World Conservation Act in 1974 in Tanzania. They did not extinguish customary land rights of the people who were living in these areas, nor did they completely prohibit consumptive uses of the resources of the area. They made the use of the resources controlled by the state, but they did not necessarily prohibit the same as is the case in a national park. Now, this is very important. Now, I will say that at independence in 1961, Serengeti was the only national park. Today, my last count, you people will help me, there are at least 20 national parks in Tanzania. And today, the total land area, the total land mass of Tanzania that is solely dedicated to conservation has surpassed is nearly 35% of the total land area of Tanzania is now covered by protected area of one category or another. Largely, the largest portion of it is our national parks, followed by game reserves. And if you look at the 2009 the World Conservation Act, in fact, today, the areas that are designated as game reserves are in fact national parks, but in name only. They for all intents and purposes, they consumptive uses of the resources of the areas have been prohibited. They are not designated as national parks. I wonder why, but the degree of dispossession of communities in areas which have been designated as game reserves since 2009 is such that as to make them akin to national parks. In other words, so what I'm saying is, since independence, the degree of dispossession of native communities, particularly the Maasai pastoralists, has been unprecedented in the entire history of conservation. Today, the areas that have been taken away from the people are enormous. And most of these areas are in Maasai land, in an area which historically has been called the Maasai land. If you look at the colonial maps of the 1950s, the colonial maps of East Africa of the 1950s, you will see an area which is described as the Maasai steppe, the Maasai rangeland. It ranges from Lake Turkana and Samburu in the north, in northern Kenya on the border with Ethiopia, all the way down to Tanganyika, and not just to northern Tanganyika, but all the way to almost central and central eastern Tanganyika, to areas beyond, close to Dodoma and Singida, to the east of Singida, north of Dodoma, close to Ngorongoro in Kilosa, and Handeni towards Tanga. That entire area is described in the colonial maps of the 1950s as Maasai land, as the Maasai steppe. And that is where the biggest concentration of national parks and other game protected areas in Tanzania and indeed in Kenya are to be found. And that is to say, the Maasai have been kicked out, have been dispossessed of those areas which are now basically the jewels in the crowns of the tourists, of the wildlife tourism industry in Tanzania and Kenya. It is a history of dispossession, of violence, of the use of state power to take these resources away from the pastoralist communities and make them available to the state and eventually to the private sector, to private commercial interests. If you look, and then someone did a study of the tourism industry in the 1990s, and they basically asked, who makes money out of tourism in East Africa? To what extent are these protected areas where millions of tourists flock into every year, to what extent is the money that is made here, in fact, even come to Tanzania, given the integrated nature of modern tourist industry? How much money do these tourists actually bring to when they come to Ngorongoro, Serengeti, or the Masai Mara, or Amboseli in Kenya? They pay the money in Europe. They pay through their credit cards, and credit card companies are mostly Western companies. The planes that bring them to East Africa, to Tanzania, these are not your planes largely. It would be the major Western airlines or Middle Eastern, Emirates, Qatar Airways, and so on and so forth. The banks that make the transactions are largely non-Eastern African banks. The tourist companies that shuttle the tourists from the airports to the national parks and back, those which take them to Zanzibar in the beaches of Zanzibar, these are largely Western companies, or East African subsidiaries of Western companies, Western tourist companies. Who controls the hotels? Whose hotels make the most money out of the tourist industry? So these questions are important because we are told the Maasai had to be kicked out of their lands because these resources are mali ya taifa. These are public property. They are for the benefit of us all. And therefore it is important we ask, if they are for the benefit of us all, let's talk about who makes the money. Who makes money out of this tourist industry? Who makes money out of the blood and tears of the Maasai now? Who will benefit when the Maasai have been violently driven out of the Ngorongoro conservation area or from Loliondo to the east? If it is for the benefit of the nation, as we are told, then let's talk about the economics of tourism. Let's see how the financial flows. But that is a matter for another day. The point that I want to stress here is tourism today is founded on violence, and it is founded on violence because these national parks have been founded out of violence against the local communities that have, for centuries, lived and protected these resources. A conservation system as it is today is a creature of dispossession, of violence by the government, and they are kept that way by violence. I had the honor of visiting literally all these areas during the 2020 general elections while campaigning. And I can tell you, speaking strictly of Tanzania, everywhere you go today where there are national parks in Tanzania, it is a semi-declared war between the Wananchi who live around these national parks and game reserves, and the park agencies and the security forces on the other. For those of you who are in Tanzania, you will remember in 2012 and 2013, the government carried out 2 military campaigns, Operation Tokomeza Ujangili and Operation Kimbunga. These were military operations carried out by the Kikwete administration. These military
around land, and if then, and I birthday. I know Tundulisu was speaking there, and I hope we will have him back. But as we continue, Tundulisu there was just talking about the land issue and just the legal issue around land. And if then, and I really appreciate Lisu's comments there, saying that if then the intention was conservation and intention is for tourism, then why not follow the due process? Tundulisu, I'm happy that you're back. Really sorry that you got cut off. We are having a bit of a technical challenge there, but you can continue, Lisu. Sorry about the interruption.
Thank you very much. I don't know where I can't remember where I ended. I've been talking to myself all along, I suspect.
All right. I know you were just wrapping up and you were talking about, and I know one of the things you mentioned is if then it's an issue of tourism and conservation, and it's really meant to help the country in terms of generating revenue from tourism, then the question is, why can't the government of Tanzania then follow a process that does not injure or perhaps even look like it's violating the human rights of communities, such as in this case the Maasai community? And you can just just give us more of your thoughts around this, Lisu.
It's not just a question of conservation. Conservation is being used as an excuse to dispossess the pastoralists and rural communities of their lands and resources. If we were to talk strictly of conservation, then I would say the Maasai communities would be at the center of that conservation effort, for the simple reason that they are the only proven guardians of these resources. The Maasai have lived in the rangelands in what is today called the Maasai rangeland. They have been around these rangelands, at least according to anthropologists, for the past 400 years. We found these wildlife resources. The Europeans who first came into these parts of the world in the last years of the 19th century found these areas teeming with wildlife, and they're still teeming with wildlife, primarily because of the Maasai and other pastoralist communities. As study upon study has shown, pastoralism of the kind that is carried out by the Maasai pastoralists is benign. It is totally consistent with the resource uses by wildlife. And that is why you find the Maasai cattle almost side by side, all mixed with the zebras and the wild beasts and so on and so forth. You find concentrations of wildlife in areas where the pastoralists are, primarily because there is no fundamental contradiction between land and resource use by cattle herders and land and resource use by wildlife. And therefore, if we are interested in conservation as conservation, then the Maasai would be at the driving seat of the effort, because they are the only proven conservators, if I may put it that way. But of course, we use conservation in order to cover other nefarious interests, in order to cover primarily commercial interests. If you take over the lands, it means the dollars that flow from tourism, the dollars that flow from tourist hunting, instead of going to these semi-literate Maasai, even though they are proven conservators, they will come to us. They will go to the state. They will support our lifestyles. We will get richer. And therefore, we go to colleges and universities, and we return after a few years waving paper certificates and claiming to know more about conservation than the people who have been conserving these resources for the past 400 years. And then we justify our paper knowledge we justify the violence that we use to get these people out of their areas by saying that we are better qualified to conserve the areas. It is it's a language that is used to justify dispossession and to justify the theft of those resources by the state and its commercial or business interests that have always come in the heels of the dispossession of the communities. And it is not just in conservation, actually. It is in so many other areas where people have been dispossessed of their lands and resources by, through the use of these arguments, these scientific sounding arguments. In 1995, between 1993 to 1995, out of these struggles of the Maasai of Ngorongoro concerning their rights in the area, the Danish government, through Danida, sponsored a major study of the Maasai land ecology and the place of the role of pastoralism in that ecology. Danida hired the late Dr. Alan Rogers. Some of you have been around and who have followed Tanzanian East African conservation would know Dr. Alan Rogers. He's now deceased. So Danida hired Dr. Alan Rogers and Kay Homewood to carry out the study of the role of Maasai pastoralists, of East African pastoralists, in the development and the conservation of the Maasai rangelands. And that study was published, I think, in 1997, 95 or 97. And the book is called The Maasai Land Ecology, Wildlife Conservation and Pastoralist Development in Ngorongoro Conservation Area, Tanzania. You can Google. It is. But I think the most important study of the role of pastoralism in the development of the East African rangelands, and as a result, and the hand-in-hand growth of wildlife in these areas. Basically, the basic argument that Alan Rogers and Kay Homewood made in their book is that there is no scientific basis. There is no scientific basis for prohibiting pastoralism in the national parks that are in the former pastoralist lands of Serengeti, Ngorongoro ecosystem. There is no scientific basis because pastoralism is consistent with conservation. You have pastoralism, you have wildlife in these areas primarily because the pastoralists have found ways of creating their pastoralist economy without having to depend on wildlife as a source of food. Unlike other communities, unlike the agro-pastoralist communities elsewhere in the country. We where I come from, where I was born and raised in Singida, we are agro-pastoralists. We hunted all our animals to extinction basically. And that also refers to many other agro-pastoralist communities in the country. We have hunted all our animals. The only people who did not hunt their animals are the Maasai communities, and they did not hunt their animals because they had their livestock. And therefore, if we want to rescue wildlife conservation wildlife in these fantastic areas. I mean, these areas are some of the most beautiful areas in the whole wide world. If we want to secure these areas in the long term, we can only do so by making sure that we integrate pastoralist development hand in hand with the conservation of these areas. In other words, bring down the walls that have separated the Maasai pastoralists from the Serengeti Ngorongoro ecosystem. Bring down those walls. If the Maasai pastoralist economy is rebuilt and made sustainable, you will have the best protection of the wildlife in the Ngorongoro Serengeti ecosystem, better than you can use with all the armies and all the weapons in the world.
Thank you, Lisu, for those comments. As we just listen to everyone's final comments from the speakers as we come to a close, and I'm really happy we've had this conversation. Many thanks to those who have, taken time as listeners to give a comment regarding tonight's topic. Lisu, I'll just go back to you. I just want to hear from you. Just one question before I go to the rest of the speakers as a parting shot.
Yeah, sorry, Leah, I just wanted to note that Stella also had her hand up, so maybe she also has
Sorry,
a question.
I didn't see Stella. Stella, go ahead before we come back to Lisu.
Right. Thank you very much. I think I appreciate Comrade Tundu Lissu's intervention, and we pray for his quick recovery, given that COVID-19 can be really, it can weigh down a person. But just quickly to respond to a lot of what he said, which makes very good sense, I think I want to ask him about the organizing of resistance question we spoke briefly about before he joined the conversation. And I think for me, given his specific individual experience with military violence and brutality of the state in Tanzania, and also considering this history of the relationship between the militarization of tourism and the securitization of conservation on one hand, for those of us who are interested in resisting against the violent dispossession of the Maasai from Ngorongoro, what sort of guidance or advice would Tundu Lissu give? Because clearly those on the ground, such as Joseph, have spelled out how violent, how brutal the state has become. So sorry about the COVID-19. We hear the symptoms. Thankfully, we are electronic. It won't catch us. But what guidance can you give in terms to how we organize resistance on behalf of Maasai, as Maasai people, given the brutality and violence of the Tanzanian state? Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. I'll just go back to you, Lisu, before we come to Joseph and just close the conversation. Lisu, I think one of the questions I'd like to ask at this point is, what next for the Maasai community? What is legally open for them or available for them in your country, Tanzania, that, a legal process they can follow towards, defending their rights? And of course, internationally, what laws are also available that perhaps they can also pursue towards, getting some legal redress?
Thank you very much. Being a trained lawyer and a practitioner in the profession, I know how tempting it always is to think that these problems will be decided by the courts. Unfortunately, our courts are not the best, they are not the most propitious, in my view, arenas for these kinds of struggles. Our courts need to be freed for the control of the state. In fact, they are part of this very violent state. And therefore, they use relying on the courts as areas which can decide these battles has very serious limitations. I'm not saying we should not go to courts. We should, but we should be wide open. We should have our eyes wide open. The courts are not the best of places. What I think we need to do, and we have not done sufficiently, but I think where these battles will be decided, these battles will be decided by the public opinion in our countries, but especially by the public opinion in the countries and the lands where the money comes from, in the lands and countries where the tourists who bring the dollars to our governments reside. Just think what will happen if what is going on in Ngorongoro and Loliondo right now was known to Western publics today. How many tourists from Europe, from North America, would want to come to Tanzania, would want to go to Ngorongoro, if they were to hear the stories of murder and mayhem and brutalization of the communities that is being done in the name of conservation? That is where we should focus much of our effort, to bring these abuses to the attention of of the world, to global attention. We should bring what is going on in these areas to the attention of our people as well. The struggles of the Maasai must be taken as part and parcel of the democratic struggles that we are fighting in Tanzania. The Maasai will not be protected if everybody else is not protected. They have not been protected in the past 60 years because everybody was not protected. And therefore, we must take them as part of the democratic struggles for a new constitutional and political order for Tanzania. Democratization of the state means basically sorry, there was an interruption. So the point I'm making is fighting for democracy writ large is also fighting for the rights and interests of the Maasai pastoralists of Tanzania and elsewhere. And therefore, we should fight internally. We should go to the courts, even though we know that they are captured. We should use them, but we should not rely on the courts. We should fight politically. We should fight in the media, in social media like we are doing now, but we should also try the hardest to bring these issues to the attention of the world. We should target the tourist companies that bring these hundreds of thousands of tourists to our region, that bring these issues to their attention, bring these issues to the attention of the world, and that way, it will be difficult to do what they are doing now, for the government of Tanzania to do what it is doing now, with the entire world watching. That is what we should be doing, in my view.
Thank you, Lisu. I want to hear from Navaya before I come to you, Joseph. Navaya, you can go ahead briefly. Navaya, can you hear me? Navaya Ndaskoi. All right. I'm not sure if Nava is able to hear me, but if Nava, you can hear me and you're having a challenge connecting, you can tap on the microphone icon on your bottom left so that you're able to connect and make your comment.
Yeah, maybe
All
I
right.
think we move on. Yeah.
Yes, let's just move on. So, Joseph, I'll give it over to you. Final comments about tonight's topic as we come to a close.
Leah, can I go now?
Yes, Lisu, thank you so much for making time for us. And we wish you a speedy recovery.
Asante,
Pole
asante,
sana. Pole sana.
asante. God bless, yeah?
God bless you too.
Good.
Okay, labda nianzie alikoishia Lisu.
Joseph,
Mambo mengi. Yes?
Joseph, in English, please. Thanks.
Okay. Oh yeah, you
Sorry.
just okay. So my last few comments about it is actually I just got the information that the ministers declared that Ngorongoro Loliondo has been actually gazetted on 17. Contrary to law, but it has been gazetted. We have not found the gazette yet. And even if the idea was to go to court, despite the fact actually we're expecting the court order, this was said, our court specifically, is not a good place for a battle. That's a fact. It's not like Kenya or others. We have almost a paralyzed system actually. So, but anyway, we can try many of the options. Lisa said, for example, we can ensure that we do not only demand for accountability in this particular case of the Maasai or Ngorongoro and Loliondo. This is just one of the evidence of how rotten our entire system is. How is our constitutional order? And I think the good things we can do is try to mobilize not only the people for purpose of this particular Maasai struggle, but to demand more than this. Because they are doing this because they know specifically that they will not be held accountable. From the president to all her lieutenants, they know no accountability will take place because our constitutions at least do not require such accountability, and especially when one of the culprits in the process include the presidency. So again, we really need to make, because there are so much lies in this process. There are so many propaganda and spinning actually now. Government has a lot of money and they can use whatever way they want, including using to finance propaganda. We have an obligation as the people, and particularly those from Ngorongoro, Loliondo, to ensure that this is known to many in a right way, to explain what it really means, what is right, and what are the facts given all the lies surrounding this process. So yes, and again, I agree with Lisu that because yes, we have internal problems, but so much influenced actually through external process. We have said this is the colonial process, and now the same organization that forced the Maasai from Serengeti, UNESCO, of course, it was not by the time, but IUCN was, and now UNESCO has joined in, Frankfurt Zoological Society. At least we must try to account them. The money used now to displace the Maasai in Ngorongoro actually has been acquired from the IMF, the African Development Banks, of course, the Japan, some institutions, and others. And we have the obligations to ensure that at least those institutions understand they are financing crime against societies in the name of conservation, but ultimately to benefit some few people with lodges, huntings, and interests, and among others. So briefly, what I can say in almost half a minute. One, we will take everything in our disposal to ensure that our rights as a society, as citizens, as human beings are protected. That include legal and advocacy, cross-border also. It might be very long. It might be taking so much long. But at least what we have seen in the last 6 months, we think so much accountability is needed because so much has been committed in the name of conservation. But this, as I have said repeatedly, is not conservation. So we have the obligations to ensure that the only way to protect our right today is to ensure that the system of governance, the justice systems, is restructured, because it cannot be, if anything is not done about our judicial systems, our governance system, then this crime will repeat and repeat and repeat again, because the system we have now is the really good breeding ground for all the crises we have been talking all about. So this is what I can say briefly. So I have just noted that the minister said Loliondo has been gazetted, which otherwise means we are not now going to think legally whether we can go back to court. Of course, we have already an application for contempt of court in the East African Court of Justice. And now, at least now include that at least it has been now established by law, which is now complicating almost every single thing.
All right. Thank you so much, Joseph. Stella Nyanzi, I know you're still there. I'm happy to have you back as a speaker. We just want to get final comments from you as we wind up the conversation tonight.
Right. So I guess for me that the news of the gazetting means that a new conversation has been opened up, because suddenly the legal questions that were raised before and given answer to seem to need new answers. And so perhaps, so this has been very fruitful in terms of at least grounding those of us who don't speak Kiswahili, but also who are not in touch with the realities on the ground and the history of Tanzania specifically. We've been brought up to scratch very quickly, and I think I want to thank Mwanzo TV for this space. Maasai lives matter, and I think because the state has now not only taken the militarization and violent brutality and threats route, but they have now gone to court and they are gazetting this indigenous land. I think that we need a new conversation. We can't just finish. I'm sorry. And so there's no way for me to conclude, because suddenly a new set of questions have been opened, and what sort of human rights violations they then justify or reintroduce or open up. So if the land is gazetted, what does it mean? Does it mean that therefore eviction is legal? Is there a process of community engagement post gazetting? So what does it mean for lay people and for organizing and for those of us who are resisting the violation of human rights and the violence and brutality that's meted out towards ordinary Maasai people living in this area? I think instead of saying, oh, I want to conclude like that or like that, I want to actually request for another meeting where the lawyers explain to us what it means in lay times. But also I think that we need to follow closely what the gazetting will introduce. If the military and police was strident, they were arrogant in how they proceeded before the gazetting, how much more harm will they do now that they have this piece of land gazetted? And so I think that eyes on the ground is important, solidarity is important to continue articulating and the issues, but then new questions have clearly been brought to the table. So for me, there's no conclusion. It's just to ask for another time for activists on the ground and lawyers and Maasai people to come and speak to to the space and update us on what the news means. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stella. I see Roland is back. Roland, you can go ahead and just give us your final comments for tonight. Roland, can you hear me? Just tap on the microphone icon on your bottom left in case it's a challenge. Fantastic. Go ahead.
What I'd like to say as I close, that Indigenous people have got right to their land. And most of these Indigenous people have already had people who have traditional knowledge of how to really, work and protect the environment. And when we talk about the rights of Indigenous,
Roland, are you there? We seem to be
had a very good retort from Joseph, just putting the reality of what has been happening. Consent, even before any action, not just eviction. Here we are actually calling for respect for the right of these people. So before any action to the land that belongs to Maasai people, because it belongs to them, pre-colonial. This land is where they've been living. This land is where they have their spiritual being. They have their heritage. This land is where they've been, they have their livelihood. They've been guarding their cattle. This land is where, they have their fathers and, forefathers living. So before anything is done in terms of any action on this land, please consult these people. But most important, let us stop the brutality. Let us stop the brutality meted on these people. Let justice prevail. Let them access justice on those who've been beaten, those who have been wounded. Humanitarian organizations also come in and support those who have fled the country and are in Kenya in hundreds. Let them be supported to get the relief, the emergency relief that they need, and let them be handled as any other person that has run away from their country because of persecution. Once we do that, then we will actually be headed into, a process where we are solving this. So thank you very much, and for organizing this, and we hope that we'll have future conversations that will bring more results in terms of solving this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland, and thank you everyone who has, been part of this space tonight. The speakers and the listeners who made time to just, share their thoughts about tonight's discussion. Maria, I don't know if you have any comments from your end before we really just wrap it up. Today we have really spilled over, but I
have no more comments. Yeah, I have no more comments there. Go on, just wrap it up. It was a great conversation. That's all I can say.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us. Again, remember this space happens every Wednesday from 7 to 9 p.m. right here on Mwanzo TV. In case you missed out on the conversation from the beginning, remember to check our YouTube channel tomorrow and just get the entire conversation from the time we began at 7 p.m. until this moment where we're ending literally